Hey guys, thanks for checking this out. I wanted to give you my thoughts and first impressions over a period of about a week of shooting a Nikon Z6. So this is my first mirrorless camera. I've never shot one before from any company, and I had a project come up that I needed to do some video, so I was able to get my hands on this one for a week and also do some still photography with it as well. So I'm mainly going to concentrate on the still photography side of things, but I'll touch on the video as well, which the video is great. I think you kind of already know that, especially compared to the D4S that I've been used to shooting. So this is the camera I'm coming from, Nikon D4S. I've been shooting this camera for well over, I think over 5 years at this point, with the Nikon 500 f4, the old heavy one. So all these thoughts that I'm going to give you right now are my comparison coming from a D4S to a Z6. So big price difference here too, right? So we're talking brand new on one of these pro body DSLRs. We're looking at $6,500 and I think around $1,800 for the body on the Z6. So over 3 times more cost on that. So I wouldn't necessarily expect these things to always perform exactly the same. So I'm not going to be surprised if they're a little bit different. And I was not surprised that they're a little bit different in the end. On the Nikon mirrorless, on the Z6, I am using the FTZ adapter because I don't have any native mirrorless lenses, and as far as I know, Nikon doesn't have any big telephoto lenses, so it's kind of the only option for me to do this for wildlife and bird photography. So everything I'm going to share with you is all, of course, my opinion based on how I like to shoot, which may not be exactly how you shoot. So, you know, some of these conclusions that I come to, that either things that are a good fit or aren't a good fit, might not be for you. So what I always recommend to everybody in these circumstances is to, you know, certainly listen to others' thoughts and opinions on these cameras, but if you can, go out and rent one yourself. If you have a friend that has one, go and shoot it for a while. And as you'll see at the end of this, I'm going to kind of take you through the progression of my first thoughts on day one when I first got the camera in my hand to after a week of shooting it. Those things change. So even just going out and shooting a camera like this for even a day is not going to tell you the whole story of it. So I think that's something really important to keep in mind. I really did want to love this Z6. I think some of the, you know, the kind of promised and existing positive features of a camera like this over a DSLR are really great, and I love where things I think are heading. You know, it's kind of my opinion that probably within 5 years, maybe right around there, everybody's going to be shooting mirrorless, myself included. But I'm not sure that it's quite there yet for me, at least with the Nikon setup. So I'm recording all of this in the same day right now, but I am going to go through my kind of thoughts and impressions from that first time getting my hands on the camera all the way through to when I finally got to shoot it a lot more and got a little bit more comfortable with it. All right, so let's jump right into it. So the first day I got this, I took it out of the box, and the first thing I noticed was how tiny and light this thing feels. Compared to this D4S full body DSLR, this thing just felt minuscule. It really did. My first impressions were it kind of felt a little cheap too, which was weird. It just doesn't have the same heft and kind of solid feel. I mean, it feels solid, but it just didn't have the same feel that I'm used to. It just felt very different, and certainly obviously looks different. So the first thing I did the first day I got it in the house here is I just mounted a 70-200 2.8 on it and started playing with it in the house, and I was just focusing on stuff, and my first impression was, wow, this viewfinder is just really weird. The electronic viewfinder, looking through that, is strange coming from an optical viewfinder. So I know that's going to take some getting used to, but I figured right off the bat that I knew that was going to be kind of a shocking thing and take me some time to get used to. Also, I noticed, just playing with this around in here, this is a 70-200 2.8, and jumping around, focusing from one thing to another, it just felt slow. And there was times, I mean, I'm experiencing it right now, there's times where it has to hunt a little bit. And so I have to wonder if that's this adapter, because This lens does not hunt. This is a fast focusing lens. It's not the most recent one, but it is the G version 2. So it's not like the real old one. But when I mount this 7200 on the D4S, it's just snappy and quick. And so my first impressions on this were kind of like, uh-oh, you know, this lens should be fast, and it's already kind of bouncing around. The next thing I did was I flipped into movie mode and started playing with it there, you know, trying to focus with that. And I quickly realized, like, oh, it's an entirely different focusing mechanism or method with video than it is for stills. I was not expecting that. I don't know why, I was under the impression that the focus was going to be the same for stills versus video because it was a mirrorless camera, right? No viewfinder. It's when I'm shooting stills or video, I can do it through the viewfinder or with the LCD. I totally thought it was going to be the same, but shocker there. The video focus is definitely different and certainly a little bit slower. So that one really surprised me. The next thing I noticed is the button placement. And this is going to be the case with any camera. Any new camera that I get, whether it be, you know, another Nikon or anything like that, the buttons just aren't all in the exact same place. They're close, but not exact. And close is not enough. I am so used to shooting without looking at any settings, you know, so keeping my eye up to the viewfinder, changing settings, and just kind of doing everything right from here, from this position. And on this camera, when I first got it, it was like I could kind of figure out how to change, you know, aperture and shutter speed here. Even the wheel up top, having this wheel up top like this compared to just the thumb wheel in the back, took a little getting used to, and it's just on that day one, it just was like, what the hell with this thing? It's so weird and different, which is to be expected. It's a very different camera. The positive things I did notice right away was the fact that it was lighter. That was definitely a nice thing. Like, hey, lighter is better. But I didn't like the lighter and kind of, and I'm not saying it is cheaper feeling or less sturdy, but it just feels that way or felt that way to me. And the other thing was I did notice on that first day playing around with it is how cool it was to actually see, you know, I could hit the menu button here and bring up the menus right in the viewfinder here and change settings and stuff like that. So that was pretty cool, and do image review in the viewfinder versus having to take my eye out and look back here. So that was kind of a cool thing. But that was about it. I didn't do really much shooting with it. I definitely didn't go outside with it. It was just, that was my first impressions of taking this camera out of the box. So next I'll jump into what it felt like in day one after shooting with it a little bit. Okay, so day one, I got out with the 500 f4, the Z6, and I went out with some friends and did some shorebird photography in one of my favorite places in New Jersey to do shorebird photography. A very difficult place, so let me just set the scene of what I was shooting. So it's in shallow water in a marsh, so it's a tidal area. It's all salt water, and half the time you're shooting, you're in the water, and a lot of the times you're balancing the camera a couple of inches over water, trying not to dip the camera in the water and get it wet, or get the lens wet, any of that stuff. Sometimes you're up on the sand where it's exposed, usually on a ground pod, but there's waves running under it, splashing all around. It's definitely an extreme shoot and condition, and I'm mainly photographing shorebirds. So a wide variety of shorebirds, but also some wading birds as well. So that's what I went out for. That being said, day one with this camera, I hated it. I hated everything about this camera. There was a couple times, if it was mine, I might have just thrown it in the damn water. I did not like this camera at all day one. The first and most difficult thing for me was the fact that the settings weren't just second nature. I had to think about every single thing I wanted to change. I had to think about, how do I change my aperture? How do I change my exposure compensation? Aperture, maybe not, I was pretty comfortable with that. But how do I change exposure compensation? How do I change my focus settings, my frame rate, my anything? Anything I was trying to change, it took me a while just to figure out how to do it. And that was so frustrating. So yeah, it was like nothing felt right. And on top of that, everything felt slow. So compared to the D4S, shooting the Z6 here, everything just felt really slow to me. Focus felt slow, just looking through the viewfinder, especially the viewfinder lag for when it has to turn on. So, you know, right now it's off, put it up to my eye, press the shutter button. Now I'm ready to shoot. All right, so I did that a little bit slower. So let me let it go off again. And oh, see, and I already forget, right? You have to press the shutter button or hit some button to wake the damn viewfinder up. So I wasn't used to that. So I would put my eye up to it and just see black. And it was like, there's a bird right there. And then by the time I figure it out and get the viewfinder active, it's either turned or moved away or something. So I was missing shots left and right. So frustrating. The button placement, like I said, was really throwing me off. That was definitely a big struggle. All right, there we go. So viewfinder off. So pick the camera up, tap the shutter button up to my eye. Okay, now I can shoot. So didn't sound like long, but there was a solid second or more of me looking at a black viewfinder there before the screen actually came up. And that was with me right now paying attention to it. So I totally get that with more experience with the camera, it'll kind of become instinctual for me to just, you know, tap the shutter button and kind of wake the viewfinder up before I get my eye up to it. But I'll tell you as I got more experience with it, how that opinion kind of changed. But up front, I was like, what in the hell? This thing was frustrating me like crazy. Also, because I was shooting in these tough conditions, it felt like I was going to break the camera. It really did, and it feels pretty solid here. You know, in my hands right now, it's like, you know, it feels solid. It doesn't feel flimsy. Everything's tight. There's no play anywhere actually. Even with the adapter, all that feels good, but it's just not this big chunky hunk of a camera, and so it just feels like I'm gonna break it. Just the fact that the camera itself is so thin, it just feels off to me. Again, not saying that is the case and that this is flimsy or breakable more easy, but it just feels that way to me. So that, I definitely noticed that. The next thing I noticed while shooting on that first day is I really do not like the electronic viewfinder. It just was so off to me. Not actually seeing the real life image through the viewfinder was just throwing me off still on day one, even after a couple hours of being out there and shooting. The other thing I noticed is, and this is still the case, it seems to not show the proper lighting through the camera. It throws the lighting off. I struggle to see the accurate lighting of the scene through the electronic viewfinder, and I don't know if it's because it's a video feed and a representation of what I'm actually seeing, but I struggle to see the true lighting on the bird. There was a lot of times I'm looking through this electronic viewfinder and I know it's harsh light out. I know it's strong sun, there's heavy shadows, and I look through that viewfinder and I'm like, this looks pretty nice. Whereas I know looking through the old optical viewfinder, that would not be the case. So that was kind of weird. And then the other thing I really noticed was it fell apart when the action got quick. So shorebirds, I was shooting some of these quick shorebirds that run, you know, all over, chasing each other, chasing food and stuff like that. So they're quick moving on their fast little legs. And so anytime I was panning really fast, trying to track one of these birds, the viewfinder was like, it was stuttering behind. It was like it was smearing the image as I was tracking it, and it just didn't look right. I did not like that at all. And then with actions such as birds in flight, stuff like that, it just seemed to really fall apart for me on day one. I couldn't get anything. And I'm sitting next to two friends, one guy that shoots Sony mirrorless and another guy who just got the brand new Canon mirrorless. I think it was the R5 he got. And they're both sitting over there raving like, oh my gosh, this focus is tracking incredible. This is amazing. And I'm just sitting there like, this sucks. It was horrible. And one of the things that it really sucked with was the, what is it called? Subject tracking. So I know one of the promises of these mirrorless cameras is that you can, you know, lock in on your subject and then just frame it however you want, right? And the camera is going to track that subject around in the frame for you. Completely useless on this on day one. And I can tell you right now, it stayed that way throughout the entire experience with this. By day 4, I didn't even attempt it anymore because I could tell how bad it was. Again, I'm shooting small shorebirds on, you know, so brown shorebirds on a muddy background sometimes, but I was low angle. The backgrounds were really distant, so there wasn't a lot of clutter for it to get caught up on. And it was just missing left and right. The subject tracking would lock on it for a second, and I'm like, oh, this is cool. And then I'd start to recompose, and then I'd watch the focus point, you know, that was tracking the subject just randomly drift off. Or it would miss and go hit the background, And then I would sit there, I'd let go of the shutter button, you know, my focus, relock on the subject again, press the focus button, try and get it to come back, and it would not come back. It was to the point of where I would have to actually manually rack focus, get the subject back close to in focus, and then it could pick it up again. So the subject tracking was just, it was entirely useless. So that was my experience with that on the Nikon. Oh, and I did forget to mention in the beginning, but I am using the most up-to-date firmware on this camera. So I know a lot of people have asked me that, which I believe as of this recording is, I'll check right now, I think it's version 3.1, but let's see, I know it's like right here, firmware version, yeah, 3.1. So I am using the most recent version of the firmware. Yeah, I think that kind of sums up all the negatives. Let's jump into a few positives from that first day. All right, so some things that I did like about this. The silent shooting mode was pretty badass. That was really cool. I did really enjoy that. It was weird at first. As always, everything with this thing was weird at first. But once I got used to how it looked through the viewfinder when I was actually shooting, and just kind of the feel for it. The shutter button feels different on this camera than it does on my other one too, on the D4S. It's kind of a little bit firmer of a press, I would say, especially to really take the photo. I feel like this one's a little bit lighter. That being said, maybe it's just 5 years of wear in on this shutter button, who knows. Yeah, that silent shooting was really, really cool. I did really get used to that and learn to love that. And I even on day one, I thought that was really cool. I really liked it. Even though the video wasn't quite what I wanted it to be with focus speed and acquisition and acquiring the initial subject with focus, I can say the video on this was by far like leaps and bounds above what this D4S does. The D4S is basically a full manual operation with video. I can do some auto metering and exposure stuff with the D4S, but focus and tracking the subject with the D4S with any lens was basically manual focus. It was all manual. So that was always really tough to shoot video with. So with this Z6, I did love that once I did get a subject in focus, I was able to track them. That being said, with video, if the subject was moving fast, especially towards me or away, it really struggled to keep up. So it would be a little bit lag behind, then it would jump up and catch up, and then the subject would come closer, and then it would finally catch up again. So I didn't really get to watch these videos in depth yet, but I kind of have a feeling it's going to be a little jumpy. But as long as the subject wasn't coming towards me or away from me really quickly, and was kind of, even if it was moving sideways, that was all pretty good. So I did really enjoy that. And it's so much nicer to shoot video through the viewfinder. So, you know, instead of having to kind of do this weird thing, right, like looking on the LCD, just having my eye up to the viewfinder for video was a huge improvement, just in how it felt comfortably to shoot, but also in target acquisition. I can find a subject so much faster when I know how to point my viewfinder, my lens and viewfinder at them, versus this kind of disconnect. Even, you know, this was nice. The flip-up LCD with focus was nice, but finding a target as they're running around on the beach and stuff like that in the mud, not easy. So I did love shooting through the viewfinder. Also with video, but also with stills, but especially with video, the stabilization was insane. It's so good. It's incredible. I was shooting, you know, I was laying down like this, right? Obviously I'm not laying down, but I was laying down holding the camera like this. And I would shoot some video like this, just with it kind of in my hand. And it was just so smooth tracking these birds around. A lot of the times I was on a ground pod as well. But just the movement and everything was really smooth and nice. And I really love the stabilization on this camera. The in-body plus the stabilization with the lens is just insane. It's, again, so far above the D4S that I was shooting. So that was awesome. The photos on the computer look really good, nice and sharp, plenty of detail, higher resolution than I'm used to on the D4S, which is nice, but not a huge bonus. I don't really care about resolution too much. What else did I notice about the files? Oh yeah, they seem to be a little bit less contrasty and saturated right off the bat. So I'm used to a little bit more punchy image when I first see it out of my D4S, but that being said, I'd rather have them less contrasty and less saturation because that's such an easy thing to bump up in post. So if it's going to be one way or the other, I'd rather have it less contrast and saturation than more. So that was totally a fine thing, just something I noticed. But yeah, everything was sharp and detailed. Oh, and I do have, I did get the extended grip on this with the extra batteries on it. And the battery life was much better than I thought. I mean, I was out there shooting for 4 and 5 hours sometimes, and I would only go through maybe like 1.5 batteries, something like that, out of this. The weird thing that threw me though, the first day on day one, is the battery indicator in the viewfinder and on the back, like in the menu system, was telling me it's getting low, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna run through all these batteries already because there's 2 in here. But it tells you that it's low on the first battery, then it switches to the second one, and then the battery indicator goes back up. So I kind of thought that was weird. I guess it would make sense if you go into the menu system to see that, but to me, it seems like if I'm running 2 batteries and it's going to switch from one to the other, I shouldn't get a low battery indicator in the viewfinder until it's getting low on the second one. I don't know, just my thoughts. Who knows, maybe there's a setting to change how that displays, but I did find that kind of weird because it made me freak out and be like, oh, I got to go get another battery. And I did that and then realized, oh wait, the other battery's fine. And you can hit a button on the back here and see the, I don't know if you can see it here, but there's lights that indicate each battery, how charged it is. So now that I know that, when I get the low battery indicator, I can check on the back and see if it's both or just one of them, but still kind of a weird thing. I think that was about it that I noticed from day one. Oh, you got a nice vertical shutter grip here with no damn buttons on it. Kind of pointless. What the hell? That's great to have the batteries, the extra batteries. That's all well and good, but no vertical shutter grip. Oh, that killed me. You know, so my camera body, the D4S, is built in, right? So it's not an attachment. These are the Pro Body bigger DSLRs, and all the buttons and configuration is here to shoot vertically. I've had that for, I had a D3S before it, so you know, for gosh, probably well over a decade now, I've been shooting a camera that has that vertical shutter grip integrated into it, and not having it all of a sudden really sucked. So that was a bummer, but you know, something I could easily work around. So that was it for day one. So let's jump into day 2 and see what my opinions changed with. Okay, by the time day 2 rolled around, I felt so much more comfortable with the camera. Just the second day in. If I had borrowed this camera from somebody or just rented it for a day, which I don't even know if you can rent for one day, but anyway, if I had just experienced this camera for one day, I would have had the opinion that this camera is a piece of trash. Nobody should buy it. It's useless for anybody. That's what my opinion coming out of day 1 was. Quite literally, by the end of the second day, I was like, oh, it's not that bad. I got a little bit more comfortable with the buttons and configurations. Based on that first day, with all the struggles and failures I had, I was able to kind of reconfigure settings. So there's not nowhere near, but there's a lot less buttons, it seems, on the outside of the camera than are on my D4S for settings and everything. But a lot of the buttons that are on this Z6 are customizable. So that really helped me to be able to configure the camera a little bit more of how I wanted it to operate based on, like I said, the failings of the day before. So that was a really helpful thing, and it made it a lot better to shoot on day 2. I also kind of was just getting a little bit more comfortable with it. I was getting more comfortable with where a lot of the settings I changed were, and so having to take my eye out of the viewfinder less to actually look at those buttons, because I mean that's a huge thing, right? So I'm shooting, and then I need to change a setting, and if I don't know how to do it without taking my eye out of the viewfinder, I have to stop looking at my subject, find the button, see where it is, change the setting, and then come back in and hopefully find my subject again. Not a good way of shooting any kind of wildlife. So getting a little bit more comfortable with that was really nice. Let's see what else. I did still have to look at the outside of the camera occasionally though to change some of those settings, so I wasn't 100% yet. This is day 2 again. So at that point, I also felt like I was much better at tracking my subjects, just keeping focus with them. I figured out the focus settings that worked the best on this, which were basically bouncing between single point and the dynamic mode on this. I really love those dynamic focus modes on these cameras over group. It's just always been a preference of mine, so that's what I stuck with, and it really seemed to work much better. I abandoned the subject tracking altogether, so I wasn't frustrated with that. And so yeah, I just overall felt like I was doing a lot better with the camera. Many of the bird in flight shots that I took on day 2 and the fast action shots were actually sharp. Even though I have to say when I was shooting it, it didn't feel like it really felt off. So the shooting experience of faster action and birds in flight still felt wrong, and not wrong, still felt like a struggle. But some of those files came in sharp and clear. So the camera was doing its job. I was struggling to use the camera. I did overall better than I thought when I actually looked at a lot of those files. So coming out of day 2, when I walked off that marsh that day, I still felt like this just was tough and I didn't get a lot, but when I looked at all the files, I'm like, oh, okay, I did a lot better than I thought, so that was nice. I absolutely love the silent shooting. That was still such a great thing. On day 2, I was like, oh, this is the way to go. Just not having that constant chunk, chunk, chunk shutter. I mean, the shutter on this thing, I don't know if I'll put this up to my mic here. It's loud. It is not subtle. The D4S is probably one of the loudest DSLRs I've ever heard. Canon cameras have always sounded quieter to me. Other Nikon cameras have always sounded quieter to me, but this thing, for whatever reason, it just sounds really loud. So going silent was really, really nice. I loved that. There was still a few negatives though. I still was not a fan of the electronic viewfinder after day 2. Especially for tracking, like I said, any of those birds in flight or fast action. The stuttering just felt off. And I gotta say, for birds in flight, the viewfinder, I was shooting the continuous high mode, silent mode, and I was shooting with the high extended. So I think with the configuration, I was shooting the 14-bit raw files, and so I think it's 9 frames a second if I'm not mistaken. Whatever, it's pretty fast. But when I would be tracking a bird in flight and then actually start firing off that burst, the viewfinder blackout between every image, it was like I was watching like a stop motion video feed of the bird. And so within 3 to 5 frames probably, maybe a little bit more, maybe like within that first 9 frames, the bird's just like out of the frame and I'm struggling to even see it in the viewfinder anymore. I had to stop shooting just to be able to pick the damn thing up again and find it in the frame and then start shooting again. So this thing does not seem like it's made for action. Again, I could have missed some settings and maybe there's something I could change to make it better, but you know, based on kind of the default stock configuration and a little bit of the customizing I did just for button placement, it just doesn't seem great for fast action. So that was really frustrating. The delay for turning the camera on was killing me too. So, you know, I talked about it earlier, just getting your eye into the viewfinder, even if the camera is woken up here and then I bring my eye up to it, okay, again, a second of black, you know. I think the viewfinder no, there we go, same thing again. So there's still a split second. Now that it's kind of awake and ready to go, it's much faster, but there's still that split second of the camera just not being on, and that was so frustrating. I was legit missing shots because I'd put my eye up to the viewfinder and see a black frame. You know, a bird would be flying in. It was coming in from just in the right spot to land because I was set up on a flock of terns, and these royal terns where every once in a while one would fly in and land with the flock. So you'd be sitting there waiting, nothing happening, nothing happening. Oh, here comes one. Point the camera at it, and oh, black frame. Okay, hit the shutter button, wake it up. Now I can see through the viewfinder, the bird already landed. Or it's so far out of the frame, I have no idea where to find it again. And then by the time I pick it up, the bird has already landed. So totally missing shots because of that. Very frustrating. Like I said, maybe if I shot it more and got more used to it, being able to wake the thing up ahead of time is great, but you know, sometimes things happen just like that, and I'm so used to picking up and seeing through the viewfinder. So that was really frustrating. And again, the subject tracking was laughable. It's just like pointless to use, at least in my experience, on these birds in flight. Hopefully that's something they can improve upon with either newer models or maybe some more firmware updates. And one other thing I want to review on day 2 that I really noticed was how important it is to be comfortable changing your camera settings, all the settings you need to be able to take most shots through your viewfinder without taking your eye out of that viewfinder. So sitting right here, you know, tracking my subject right now and being able to adjust my exposure compensation, done, right? If I'm in manual mode, lower my shutter speed. You know, if I'm in aperture priority or anything, change my aperture, which I never change my aperture, but being able to do that. Being able to change my focus settings. So I can do that right here now. There we go. So now I'm changed into dynamic. Now I'm back to single point. So doing that on the fly, just being able to move my focus point around if I choose to reframe that way versus actually you know, focusing, locking and recomposing, being able to do that, right? Hold my back button to lock focus and then recompose, which is how I use back button autofocus. Just all of these things, being able to change them while keeping my eye in the viewfinder is so unbelievably important. There were so many shots on the first day and even on the second day that I missed because I had to take my eye out of that viewfinder to be able to look at the camera and see where the buttons were. If you're a shooter that's currently doing that, I cannot recommend enough to work with your camera and shoot a lot to be able to figure out how to change those settings without taking your eye out of the viewfinder. You're going to see such an improvement in your quality of photography and ability to stay with your subject by being able to figure that out and learn that. So that's my tip on that. I just wanted to make sure to mention that. So I'm going to skip day 3 and just kind of go right to day 4 and then the overall conclusions, because I know this is getting a little long. All right, so day 4. Now I've been shooting with this camera for a decent amount of time. Overall, feel so much better about the camera, a lot more comfortable with it. I can operate it entirely without taking my eye out of the viewfinder, which is a huge bonus. So that just overall made me feel a lot better, a lot more comfortable. Overall, it feels like a Nikon. It really does. After the 4th day, I definitely am just like, yep, this is a pretty standard Nikon camera. Now that I'm used to where the button placement is and those things, it just feels like a Nikon. The photos look great and are exactly what I would expect from Nikon files. I would say I didn't really dive into it a ton, but at first impression, I shot one photo of a raccoon that was well after sunset as I was coming back in. From on the water with the kayak. I shot one with the 500 and it was, I think it ended up being at 16,000 ISO, and a quick look on the computer, that thing looks pretty clean. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, the ISO is probably a little bit cleaner than my D4S, which is saying a lot because this camera is like incredible in low light. So that's really awesome. I definitely got a better feel for the video autofocus by day 4. So I was a lot more comfortable tracking subjects with video. I was shooting a ton of video for this project I had. And so I definitely did get a lot of practice with shooting video on it. And like I said, it still seemed weird to me that it uses a different autofocus system or, you know, settings in the camera for video versus stills. But I can also kind of see how that makes sense, right? So with video, you're shooting you know, the entire time that the thing is tracking focus. So if the camera was constantly just like zipping in and out to maintain focus, that video would be jumpy as hell. So I get that it makes sense that it's a little bit slower to transition from one thing to another. But when trying to shoot some of these birds that are kind of walking really quick and coming towards me and further away and even just sideways, it was pretty tough. But as long as the birds weren't moving crazy fast, the video, the focus locked right on and the video looked amazing. The quality of the video, the 4K I was shooting looked incredible, unbelievably sharp, really nice. I am by far not an expert on video, so it's just kind of my first impressions of it. I don't know a lot about different codecs and settings and all that stuff. I just left the video kind of standard and shot it that way. And I do a very basic edit in Adobe Premiere. So knowing that, everything looked really good though. I was really happy with how the video looked. So yeah, even after 4 days of shooting with this camera, I still don't love or like actually the electronic viewfinder. That viewfinder lag, especially with the turning on and activating and the just overall stuttering and that kind of smearing when I'm tracking subjects, just didn't really like it. Even though I managed some sharp birds in flight photos, I really did not like the overall feel of how it was to track birds in flight with this camera. The viewfinder, the way it blacked out when I was shooting, and the fact that the subject would just fly right out of the frame without me even knowing because I couldn't see because it was, you know, like this slow blackout in the camera. I just really didn't like that. So maybe something I'd get more used to with time, but after, you know, getting really comfortable with everything else with the camera, that still really felt off. It still feels less sturdy and it feels less weatherproof. Again, this is just my impression of how it feels. I don't really know how it is. I haven't put it through a ton of paces. It did hold up in those shooting conditions, you know, so I did get a little bit of water splashed on it, just nothing crazy, not like a wave over top of it, but, you know, splashes of water and stuff like that, and never stopped shooting, you know, never had any problems. But it just does not feel quite as sturdy as a big old tank of a D4S. And I definitely miss the buttons on the vertical shutter grip. That's kind of a bummer that you can't do anything, even if adding the shutter grip onto this doesn't give you the vertical shutter buttons and settings to be able to operate your shutter speed and aperture and exposure compensation and stuff like that. So a little bit of a bummer there. I definitely miss those, but so that's kind of my overall impression. So let me just jump into giving you the final overall impressions of this camera after shooting with it for just shy of a week. So after shooting with this for a solid 4 days, many hours each day, putting thousands of frames through the thing, what do I think of the Nikon Z6? Well, I would totally recommend it for anybody that's coming from a kind of an entry-level or mid-tier DSLR. I think it's a great camera if you're used to those level of cameras, and you probably, if anything, it'll seem like an upgrade for you, or at least on par, plus giving you those mirrorless benefits that I talked about. I would also recommend it for anybody who is just mainly shooting wildlife portraits. So if you're not doing a ton of birds in flight or really fast moving birds, like these shorebirds are surprisingly quick when they're running around. So if you're not shooting that sort of stuff, I think this is a great camera for you. In probably 50 to 60% of everything I shoot, this camera would be a totally fine fit in those regards. But it's just when I start getting into the faster action stuff is where it all seems to kind of fall apart for me. And it's certainly a huge recommend for anybody shooting video, especially wildlife video. I thought it was great for that. I certainly don't have a ton of experience with dedicated video cameras that you can shoot wildlife and stuff like that with. So, you know, my only comparison is this D4S, which is not meant for video at all. Video is a very second thought add-on on that camera. So I did absolutely love it for that, and for the video that I shoot, which isn't a lot, but for the video I shoot, it's a huge improvement over what I was shooting. So I really enjoyed that. Overall though, if you're an action shooter and you love shooting the fast moving stuff, I don't think I could recommend this camera to you. It seems like a huge miss with the object tracking on this camera. That seems like such a great concept. And from talking to the guys I was shooting with earlier this week on their Canon and Sony systems, they absolutely love that feature. You know, I was sitting next to the Canon guy and he's sitting there, he's like, oh my gosh, this thing is tracking this bird's eye as it moves around the frame. He says, this feels like cheating. And I'm sitting over there like, this thing's just failing left and right, you know? So totally different experience. So, you know, if Nikon can get their game updated in that regard, I think it would be a huge bonus there, because I know that is certainly one of these kind of benefits that a mirrorless camera can provide that the old style autofocus can't quite keep up with. Overall for me, it's just not a great fit. So I will not be buying a Z6, at least not anytime soon. I'm hoping that they come out with a newer version, an updated version of this or the next model. And then I'll probably be interested in picking up one of those to just kind of really get more experience with a mirrorless camera. Plus I am shooting more and more video, so that would be nice for that. And I'm doing more things that the silent shutter alone is a huge benefit for. So that's why I really wanted to love this camera, because I probably would have bought one right away after renting it. But I think at this point, I'm just gonna wait. But for everybody else that's watching this, what I would highly recommend is to rent the camera you're interested in trying, whether it be a Z6 or anything else. I think it makes sense to not rely on others' opinions for these cameras. So it's great to listen to reviews, just like the one I'm doing right now, and all the other ones out there. You know, listen to the opinion of others, but just because it's not a good fit for me doesn't mean it won't be a perfect fit or a really good fit for you. And the same thing goes with anybody else. If anybody else is telling you, definitely don't buy this camera, definitely do buy this camera, I think you should be wary of listening to them. You know, these experiences that I shared with you today are based on how I shoot and based on what I came from and based on just my overall feelings on this camera. That doesn't mean it's going to be the same for you. And, you know, you may have a different style of shooting. You may have different end goals for your photography, and it may be a great fit for those. So if you can, I highly recommend renting a camera like this and giving it some time. So you'll notice from day one and my first impressions of taking this camera out to the end, I definitely improved a lot. So day one, I wouldn't have recommended this to anybody. In fact, I would have vocally said, do not get this camera. But by day 4 already, it's like, okay, yeah, this camera's pretty solid. You know, I can see some good stuff there. It's still not a good fit for me. It just still really felt like it fell apart with fast action and autofocus, and overall just feeling a little bit slower. But again, it's a lot less money for that camera than the camera I'm used to. So that probably plays into it as well. So thanks so much for watching. I know this was a long one. I gave you a lot to think about there, but hopefully you enjoyed my thoughts on this camera, and happy shooting out there.